Hey, what's up, guys? So this was the last slide from 24A. We're going to continue with 27B. So this is Birmingham, Alabama. One more time. Remember, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, was leading African Americans in their civil rights. What we see here is exactly what was explained in the previous slide. So we have the Birmingham Fire Department hosing down protests like tumbleweeds. High pressure, it was going to knock anybody out of their feet because of how much power these water hoses have. On the lower right hand side here, we see Birmingham police attacking peaceful protesters. And again, these peaceful protesters did it because they were abiding by Martin Luther King, and he felt that peaceful protesting was the best method to get across their message. And you see Martin Luther King arrested in the Birmingham police department and jails up here on the top right hand side as well. So we're going to continue a little bit with the civil rights movement. So on August 28, 1963, so this was about 5 months after the Birmingham incident, we have the March on Washington. 250,000 people marched to Washington, D.C. This is both black and whites, and they are marching for jobs, integration, equality, and rights. If we look at our attention over here on the right hand side, this picture, this is the marchers arriving on Washington, D.C. You see Martin Luther King there, and you notice they're protesting. They're protesting for jobs. They're protesting for voting rights. They're protesting to end segregation in public schools. They're protesting for equal rights more than anything. So here, this is also where Martin Luther King, he pronounces his "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. That is very symbolic because Lincoln was the one that started issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, the first step to liberate slave people. And then the 13th Amendment, again, passed by Lincoln nearly 100 years earlier on January 1865, which freed African Americans. So symbolic that Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech there. And in his "I Have a Dream" speech, he talks about how he dreams of one day his kids who are black would be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. So these peaceful protests continue, but we have a new grassroots organization here, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, sometimes known as SNCC. Simply, this is young African Americans who are doing pretty much the same thing that SCLC is doing, but they are being a little bit more militant about it. They're putting more pressure on politicians. John Lewis is a young individual here, and he starts to grow tired of this nonviolence and the slow growth by white congressmen to react to the demands of African Americans. And so he wants to push for a little bit more of a militant spirit. This kind of breaks or divides the civil rights movement a little bit. Now you have two groups of people, those who want civil rights through peaceful protest and those who want civil rights through a little bit more militant protest. And things don't get any better. The following month, after King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech, a white supremacist throws a bomb at a Baptist church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 young girls. And so we continue to see that violence continues to escalate, and yet African Americans are not getting whatever they wanted. And then tragedy strikes the United States yet again. On November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. You recall, John F. Kennedy was the president who was trying to advocate also for civil rights, who was trying to give African Americans some form of equality. But with his assassination, for African Americans, it seems that all hopes of equality were dashed. When John F. Kennedy is assassinated, a new president comes in, the vice president, which is Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ. And this is what we see here in this next slide. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is finally signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. You see him signing it over here on the left-hand side with Martin Luther King right behind him, and both gentlemen actually shaking hands on the right-hand side. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it allowed discrimination in employment. It guaranteed equal access to public accommodations such as parks, theaters, the different lunch counters, and it also schools, guarantee for equal access to schools for all people. It established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and what it was supposed to do was to make sure that people were not discriminating when hiring for employment purposes. However, the other thing that was left out in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was there was nothing said about voting rights for African Americans. It was a huge milestone, though, because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the first civil rights bill that is passed in nearly 100 years since the Reconstruction era. So African Americans did gain something here. Again, because there was nothing said there on voting and because Congress was lost to react, African Americans take to the streets to protest yet again. And this leads us to March 1965, Selma, Alabama, or what becomes known as Bloody Sunday. So we see again incidents in Alabama. So this happens because SCLC member James Val called for a march to protest the murder of a voting rights activist and voting rights period. So what happens is African Americans go down to Selma, Alabama. They start to help African Americans register to vote. And as they're doing this, one of these voting rights activists is killed. So James Val and SCLC, they call for a march to protest this violence. Well, these protests assemble, and what happens is the Alabama state troopers, they mount horses as they're marching across the bridge here, the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And the Alabama state troopers, they mounted on horses, begin to attack the protesters with clubs, which you see here on the top left-hand side, and with tear gas as well, which you see here. And again, these people were protesting peacefully, so they were being attacked by the same people that were supposed to be protecting them, the state troopers. So we see again that the 14th Amendment, equal protection, is being violated. The attack was caught on television, and it brought the horrors again of the civil rights to people's home. And people, white and black, were completely upset of the way the state troopers handled the situation. So about, I believe it was 2 weeks later, a second march is launched. And at this point, it's a little bit more successful. And that march on Selma is what pushes LBJ to sign the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965, which outlawed the literacy test, which had been established again since Reconstruction nearly 100 years earlier. And it also helped people register to vote with the protection of the federal government. So, one more time, African Americans were able to gain some rights, but blood was shed in the struggles to gain equality. This map kind of shows us that during the midst of the civil rights movement, there was many riots in different parts of the country, including the Watts riots in California, among others, in Chicago, in Michigan, in New York, naturally all across the South. So people were being harmed because of the whole idea of equal rights. And this is the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. Great piece of art and a great part of American history as well. We'll finish it up now with the Chicano movement. So in the Southwest, from Texas to California, people of Mexican descent also endure a Jim Crow type of system. It was more of a caste system. They were disenfranchised as well. They were paid low wages. They also suffer employment discrimination and horrible segregating housing. These workers, which I'm going to be talking about, agricultural workers in particular, they live in places that had no electricity, no plumbing, the rent was high, and the wages were low. And during the World War II, over 400,000 Mexican people of Mexican descent also served during the war. So when they came back, they also took advantage of the GI Bill. And remember, the GI Bill was helping people go to college. And so as these Mexican descent people got an education and started getting jobs, we also see a rise of middle class Mexican Americans as well. So just like African Americans, they started to demand equal rights because they realized that their civil rights were being violated. In 1947, in Mendez versus Minister, 5 Mexican American parents sued the school because it was segregated and they were forced to send their children to a school further away from their home. Well, in this case, in California, it is ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Now keep that in mind. That was 1947. This is 7 years before Brown versus the Board of Education. So the fact that segregated schools endured 7 more years until the Supreme Court had to tell the entire country to eliminate segregation shows you the continued resistance of whites to try to integrate as well. So these 2 pictures here that you see, so that's Cesar Chavez right there. He is the leader of the Chicano movement, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in the next slide. And this is Robert Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, the president. Again, the 2 men, John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, were interested in civil rights. One of the first presidents to openly come out and talk about civil rights. Remember, Truman desegregated the armed forces. Eisenhower didn't do a whole lot. He sent the troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, with the Little Rock Nine, but they didn't do a whole lot as well either. And it wasn't until John F. Kennedy that comes to power that he actually takes an interest in helping minorities of all people. And this is also Cesar Chavez. I'm sure you were able to recognize that by now. So finally, in 1962, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, they focused their attention on the agricultural workers in Delano, California. These agricultural workers were enduring the conditions that I just mentioned earlier. High rent, low wages, horrible living conditions, and they were not unionized. So Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta established the United Farm Workers, or the UFW, as a labor union, not only for Mexicans, but also Filipinos. A lot of Filipinos were working alongside Mexicans in these fields, and they were also being discriminated. You see the logo on the background in this slide. That is the logo of the United Farm Workers. Their slogan was the one that's up here behind Cesar Chavez, or beneath Cesar Chavez. So, sí se puede. Yes, you can't. In 1965, they launched La Causa. So this is a boycott on grapes. So these landowners, where grapes were being grown, they refused to give workers higher wages. They refused to lower their rent. They refused to allow these Mexican and Filipino workers to be unionized. So what Cesar Chavez does, he launches a boycott of all grapes, and it harms the economy greatly. And this is a boycott all across the nation. So it was very powerful. And again, this is in 1965, right? Right around the same time that African Americans are demanding for their equal rights. So both groups are fighting for a cause of civil rights. Boycott grapes has a major success because people are being heard not only in the grapes, but also in raisins and wine. And that's the biggest cause of economic decline. The wine. People stopped buying any products that were grown in these fields where the employers refused to provide better wages for the workers. However, they continued to struggle. In 1968, Cesar Chavez launches a hunger strike, lasted 28 days. Again, it helped for the workers to gain some of their rights. And finally, in 1970, the grape landowners recognized the USW as the union for these agricultural workers. They agreed to provide higher wages, better living conditions, and again, recognize the union as well. So, 1960s, very turmoil times. Sometimes they're known as the stormy 60s because all the problems that were going around across the entire country. And unfortunately, today we continue to see some of the similar problems that the United States continues to face. I'll leave you with this one last slide now that you know a little bit of your history. On the top left, we have Emmett Till, who was murdered by Roy Bryan and J.W. Millen, and both men were acquitted. That was on 1958. On the lower right-hand side, you have Trayvon Martin, who was murdered on February 22nd, 2012, murdered by George Zimmerman, and he was also acquitted in Florida. So 58 years difference, and it seems that the United States continue to be plagued by racial issues.